Hello there, and welcome to Dream Past Diaries. I'm truly glad you've made it here. Maybe it's been a long day, or maybe you're the kind of dreamer who prefers to drift off to the sound of quiet thoughts and forgotten mysteries instead of counting sheep. Either way, tonight's story is yours to enjoy. You don't have to do anything now, just rest. Let your thoughts slow, your breath deepen, and your body grow lighter, as if gravity itself has begun to fade away.
In the long quiet stretch of medieval Europe, where mornings unfolded slowly with the faint smell of damp earth rising from the fields and the distant echo of wooden church bells drifting lazily through the hazy air, there lived many people whose ordinary habits, those simple, harmless, everyday behaviors that today would raise no concern at all, were seen by their neighbors as subtle signs of imbalance, as if the very fabric of the mind could be judged by the smallest gesture or preference. And, among these misunderstood behaviors, perhaps none was more quietly feared than the tendency of certain villagers to remain hushed, withdrawn, and contemplative, choosing not out of discomfort but out of comfort itself to avoid the constant buzz of chatter that filled the communal spaces. Yet in a world where the rhythm of life was shared loudly, where threshing fields required many hands and many voices, where communal baking meant hours of kneading and gossip, where evenings near the hearth involved repeated stories and long prayers, silence was often treated not as a personality trait but as an omen, and so the quiet ones became subjects of gentle suspicion, watched with a sort of soft unease by those who believed that too much stillness of tongue must surely indicate some deeper stillness of soul. The medieval mind was shaped by an intricate blend of faith, superstition, and limited medical knowledge, so when a person preferred to sit alone near the low stone wall by the village well, observing the shifting patterns of light on the water or the slow crawl of ivy on ancient masonry, they were often thought to be wrestling with invisible inner troubles, though in truth many simply enjoyed the soft repetition of natural sounds, the rhythmic splash of buckets, the distant bleating of goats, the hum of bees lingering near blooming herbs, and this gentle soundscape offered them a kind of peace that the crowded marketplace never did. Yet villagers saw their silence and wondered whether their thoughts drifted toward troubling realms, for they believed the mind, if left too quiet, might wander into territories where spirits whispered or melancholy brewed. And so, as the seasons turned with the same slow predictability, spring bringing wet mornings and the scent of new grass, summer stretching long blue skies over warm wooden rooftops, autumn dropping crisp leaves onto muddy paths, and winter drawing families nearer to the hearth, the perception of these quiet individuals remained unchanged, reinforcing the idea that those who lingered in thought too often were fragile in ways unseen, and the quiet ones themselves, though aware of the glances or the hushed remarks exchanged behind their backs, usually carried on with their routines gently and undisturbed, rising early to tend livestock, fetching water with deliberate slowness, smoothing hay into neat piles, or grinding grain at the mill where the turning wheel made a restful, soothing creak. Despite the gentle rhythm of their days, villagers continued to feel that silence was dangerous when held too tightly, for in their worldview, loudness meant health, shouted greetings, communal labor, festive songs, even arguments demonstrated vitality. So anyone who preferred silence seemed to be withdrawing from the shared pulse of the community, becoming a quiet island in a world that valued noise as proof of life. The quiet ones, however, found comfort in repetition, the steady brushing of wool, the gradual filling of baskets, the predictable path from cottage to stable to field, and this familiarity gave them a sense of grounding that conversation sometimes disrupted. Yet medieval observers mistook this love of routine for mental frailty, believing that those who disliked social activity might be overwhelmed by thoughts too heavy to share in the evenings, when candles flickered gently in wooden holders, and families gathered for simple meals of bread, broth, and perhaps a bit of goat cheese or foraged herbs. The quiet ones often sat slightly apart, listening rather than speaking, absorbing the soft drone of voices like waves rolling endlessly against a shore, and though this gave them peace, it caused others to wonder if they carried secret burdens, unseen sorrows, or lingering fears. However, the truth was much simpler. They liked the stillness that settled over their minds when they did not have to form answers, and they preferred watching the shadows dance across the cottage walls too, engaging in long discussions about harvest yields or market prices. Thus, in the calm, slow-moving world of medieval daily life, where every gesture carried symbolic weight and every deviation from expected behavior invited speculation, the quiet ones lived gently, neither troubled nor troubling, yet forever marked by the assumptions of those around them, who could not imagine that silence could simply be a preference rather than a symptom, and so the quiet ones continued their peaceful routines, drifting through their days like soft breezes passing unnoticed. Through the village lanes, their silence misread, their calm misunderstood, their gentle presence interpreted through lenses shaped not by truth but by the limitations and fears of the age, and in this way their lives became reflections of a medieval world that struggled to grasp the many shapes the human mind could take. In the gentle, unhurried rhythm of medieval life, where the days moved with the predictable certainty of sun rising over thatched roofs and sinking behind the distant hills, there were always those whose eyes seemed to wander endlessly, fixed upon nothing yet everything at once, and villagers, moving along narrow dirt streets with baskets in hand or returning from the fields with a slow clatter of wooden clogs on stone, often paused to notice these distant stares, for in a society where every gaze and gesture was measured against familiar norms, a prolonged, unfocused look was thought to carry hidden meaning, a reflection not of idle curiosity or quiet contemplation, but of a mind that had become untethered from ordinary reason or from the steady, communal pulse of everyday work, and as the seasons unrolled in their habitual patterns, spring bringing the muddy scent of rain-soaked fields, summer stretching long golden days across tilled earth, autumn letting brittle leaves settle over worn pathways, and winter cloaking cottages in smoke and frost, these wandering eyes continued to draw quiet attention, eliciting soft whispers that drifted between neighbors, speculations of melancholy, of spirits hovering unseen, or of otherworldly messages imparted through visions, though in truth the eyes simply observed the small, endlessly changing world in a way that was natural, even soothing, yet incomprehensible to those who expected constant engagement with others, and the more the observer tried to explain the delicate, slow patterns of thought, the more they seemed to drift into an invisible realm, measured not by clocks or market schedules, but by the shifting positions of sun and cloud, the subtle bend of a tree branch, the soft ripple of water along the village brook, and each slow blink, each pause between breaths, each gentle turn of the head was interpreted not as meditation or reflection, but as a symptom of inward wandering that might, in the minds of cautious neighbors, lead to trouble or spiritual imbalance. For the medieval imagination, nurtured by faith and superstition, was particularly adept at reading mystery where there was none, and even the most ordinary human curiosity was cast as a delicate warning of deviation from communal norms. The distant stare, though unremarkable in intention, often became a focal point of village life, a quiet rhythm against which all other activity seemed measured, and people who walked past might adjust their steps, soften their words, or even pause mid-task to acknowledge the figure whose gaze stretched beyond the immediate, seeming to dwell on invisible landscapes, for the observer's mind often moved in gentle loops, tracing the same soft thoughts repeatedly, like the rotation of a mill wheel, turning slowly against the murmur of water, repeating patterns that were calming to the thinker but subtly alarming to those who equated productivity with virtue, engagement with morality, and social participation with sanity, and in this way the small act of looking quietly into distance became a social signal, an unintended communication about the nature of thought itself, though it was rarely noticed by the one whose eyes wandered, who moved with the same unhurried cadence as the rustling leaves, the flickering candle flames, the soft ticking of water dripping into troughs. By evening, as hearth fires glowed dimly behind smoke-stained windows and families gathered around simple bowls of broth and bread, the distant stares continued unnoticed in their own eyes, but were discussed quietly by others in whispers that carried no malice, only curiosity and concern, as villagers speculated about invisible burdens and imagined causes that might never exist. For the medieval worldview was shaped by a desire to find meaning, and where meaning was absent, the mind could supply any number of hidden explanations, and so the person who seemed lost in thought became a repository for collective anxiety, a symbol of both human fragility and the mystery of inner life. Yet despite this external scrutiny, their own experience remained profoundly ordinary and gentle, a slow unfolding of awareness and observation that moved in tandem with the soft rhythms of the natural and human worlds, undisturbed by the passing opinions and the repetition of quiet observation. The soft attention to subtle changes in light, weather, and human movement became a private pattern as comforting as the steady drip of rain into a hollow barrel or the faint rustle of hay in the barn, and while medieval neighbors could not perceive its calming effects, the distant stares were an expression of careful thought, of patience, and of a mind attuned to the small, often overlooked details of existence, the tiny changes in the color of the sky, the tilt of branches, the slowness of a goat's movement across a courtyard, the hush of wind in a field of wheat, and these small attentions brought a quiet, deep satisfaction. To the observer, a sense of inner continuity that no gossip or whispered suspicion could disrupt. Even as children ran barefoot across cobblestones, dogs barked in the distance, and the blacksmith's hammer rang against the anvil with repetitive certainty, the distant stares persisted, and the villagers learned, slowly and without interruption, to accept their presence as part of the fabric of daily life, though their curiosity never fully waned, because the medieval mind was always attuned to the unusual, to the variations of behavior that hinted at hidden truths, and each day, the quiet. Figure's gaze shifted gently from the horizon to the stone wall, from the barn door to the village square, tracing movements invisible to others, yet entirely real in the experience of thought itself, and thus the distant stare remained both ordinary and extraordinary, simultaneously a mark of mundane human observation and a subject of cautious fascination, a slow, enduring rhythm that harmonized with. In the soft, repetitive cadence of medieval village life, where days were measured by the rising and setting of the sun, the tolling of distant church bells, and the steady rhythms of daily work, it was not uncommon to see people murmuring quietly to themselves as they went about their chores, yet such behavior, though entirely natural and often comforting to the speaker, was frequently observed by neighbors with quiet concern. For in a world that equated speech with social engagement and the absence of conversation with suspicion, even the gentlest whispers to oneself could be misinterpreted as evidence of mental imbalance or spiritual disturbance, and as the villagers carried baskets of herbs, water, or grain along narrow, uneven paths, they would glance toward the murmurers with mild curiosity, imagining that some hidden worry or secret thought might be playing out beneath the surface of the ordinary and mundane, though in reality the practice of speaking softly to oneself served many practical and psychological purposes, from helping to remember instructions and count tasks to repeating prayers or simply finding companionship in one's own quiet thoughts. And as the day stretched lazily across the fields, with sun casting long, soft shadows over tilled soil and wooden fences, the murmuring of the self became a subtle soundtrack to the measured pace of life, accompanying the repetitive sounds of tools against stone, the soft shuffle of animals' hooves, the rustling of leaves in gentle wind, and the distant clanging of the blacksmith's hammer. And in this world, the practice was entirely ordinary, yet constantly observed and often misunderstood, for villagers had learned over generations to interpret behaviors that did not immediately conform to social expectations as signs of fragility, deviation, or otherness, and thus speaking to oneself, though often performed without thought of consequence, became a quiet indicator to others, a gentle signal of difference, though it caused little disruption to the speaker's life, who continued to measure the slow patterns of the day with words spoken under breath, often repeating instructions, counting the strokes of a broom against stone, or quietly narrating tasks in a way that helped maintain focus and calm, while neighbors speculated on invisible burdens, believing the murmured words to reflect inner disturbances or hidden torments, when in truth they were merely expressions of concentration, reflection, and self-soothing, blending seamlessly with the slow, hypnotic rhythm of the surrounding environment, which itself moved with an unhurried predictability that was both comforting and endless. The medieval imagination, colored by superstition, religious belief, and limited understanding of human psychology, often transformed these small, private conversations into narratives of warning or concern, so that a woman whispering measurements of cloth while weaving at the loom might be thought to be consulting unseen forces, or a man repeating the steps of his tasks aloud could be imagined to be negotiating with spirits that no one else could see. Yet the repetition, the gentle cadence, the soft articulation of routine thoughts served primarily to structure the mind in an otherwise endlessly repetitive and physically demanding world, providing a form of inner rhythm that complemented the outer rhythm of work and nature, and in the quiet solitude of personal labor, these whispered words were a source of calm, enabling focus, reflection, and continuity, offering a gentle, meditative accompaniment to the endless motion of daily tasks. As the day wore on, the murmurs persisted quietly and unobtrusively, counting the number of loaves needed for baking, softly recalling which fields needed tending, or quietly naming each animal as it passed, creating a private rhythm that harmonized with the rustle of grain. The soft clatter of tools, the murmur of water from troughs, and the distant calls of villagers moving about their chores. And while these acts were ordinary, they were constantly noted by those who preferred to measure normality by the immediate conformity of visible action, and thus the whisperer's mind, fully absorbed in its own steady, private currents, became a subtle focal point for observation, a quiet signal that inspired curiosity rather than alarm, though the interpretation was shaped entirely by the culture's slow, methodical understanding of human behavior, where each gesture and habit was weighed for meaning beyond the immediate, and even the simplest, most mundane whisper could be read as an indicator of inner imbalance, though it caused no disturbance, no complaint, no harm, existing only as a personal tool for maintaining focus and inner calm, a private companion to the endless repetition of daily labor, the steady cycles of light and shadow, the slow changes of seasons, the habitual sounds of village life, and the soft, comforting continuity of familiar routines. By evening, when candles flickered and smoke curled lazily toward the rafters, those who had murmured quietly to themselves continued their gentle repetitions while the world around them discussed, observed, and speculated. And though the whispers were rarely heard by others unless they paused in their labors or walked too near, the practice persisted, blending seamlessly into the unhurried flow of medieval life, a subtle but persistent reminder that human beings, even in the simplest of times, often created soft patterns of self-communication to navigate the slow, repeating rhythms of existence, and that these patterns, entirely ordinary in intention and effect, were capable of creating minor ripples in the perceptions of others, while the whisperers themselves remained absorbed, calm, and untroubled, gently navigating a world defined by rhythm, repetition, and the soft, endless march of medieval neighbors, however, whose understanding of behavior was framed by long-standing patterns of social expectation and moral teaching, often imagined that such withdrawal implied vulnerability, melancholy, or some hidden burden, for in a world where daily work, shared meals, and public prayer were considered markers of proper human engagement, the quiet presence of someone who lingered in thought or in solitude was a subtle deviation, noted and discussed in whispers. Yet these judgments, though constant and sometimes weighing heavily in the mind of the solitary individual, rarely caused actual distress, for the rhythms of daily life, the slow unfolding of repetitive labor, and the comforting continuity of nature itself created a soft shield around thought and emotion, allowing an inward focus that was both protective and deeply soothing. And in the steady turn of hours from dawn to dusk, from dawn again, the gentle companionship of solitude remained constant, a reassuring presence that required no validation, no audience, and no explanation beyond the quiet satisfaction of existing in the moment with one's own mind. And as the seasons changed slowly over the years, the habit of seeking such calm moments persisted, creating a life quietly ordered around observation, reflection, and small, soothing repetitions. And while others could only speculate on the meaning of this preference for loneliness, those who practiced it knew its simple truth, that being alone did not indicate weakness or disorder, but instead allowed the mind to move gently and without interference through the soft, recurring patterns of ordinary life, aligning naturally with the unhurried rhythm of medieval days, the quiet passing of time, and the gentle, endless procession of nature itself. Even as work in the fields demanded attention, the bread needed kneading, the animals needed tending, and the village bells rang with slow, unchanging regularity, those who sought solitude continued to find. In the quiet, repetitive rhythms of medieval domestic life, where every day unfolded with measured regularity, and where the sound of wooden tools against stone and the soft rustle of straw beneath one's feet provided a constant, gentle backdrop, there were those whose attention to the arrangement of their surroundings seemed almost obsessive, for in a world where labor was constant and the pace of life demanded endurance rather than refinement, to spend additional care upon the alignment of objects, the sweeping of floors to absolute evenness, or the meticulous stacking of firewood could be noticed by neighbors as unusual, though the individuals themselves were rarely aware of the degree of observation their habits attracted, and such tidiness, repetitive and deliberate, provided them with a subtle sense of control and comfort, a quiet assurance that their small corner of the world could be rendered orderly in a life otherwise governed by unpredictable seasons, variable harvests, and the endless, slow cycle of daily toil. And in this careful attention, each action became a meditative repetition. The broom brushing back and forth across the packed dirt of the floor, the soft placement of each wooden bowl in a line along a shelf, the gentle stacking of grain sacks in perfect alignment, each motion performed with slow, deliberate care, producing a quiet satisfaction that was calming, hypnotic, and self-reinforcing. And though neighbors sometimes whispered softly about these patterns, imagining that such diligence might reflect an anxious or troubled mind, the truth was much simpler, as the meticulous alignment of one's environment created a rhythm that matched the steady cadence of life itself, a small, private harmony that resonated with the soft regularity of day passing into night, sun rising and setting, seasons moving predictably, and the slow, measured cycles of work that defined the village. Point 7. Even the simplest details became significant in this careful attention. The gentle smoothing of a woven mat so that each strand lay perfectly flat, the arranging of herbs in tidy bundles for drying, the meticulous folding of cloth in preparation for future use, and the slow stacking of kindling in a precise pyramid to ensure that each piece was accessible and orderly. Actions that might go unnoticed by the casual observer but which produced a profound sense of inner satisfaction for their practitioner, reinforcing the comforting illusion that the immediate world could be rendered controllable, predictable, and safe. And in this repetition, there was a hypnotic quality, a soothing, sleep-inducing rhythm in the small motions that mirrored the larger, predictable cycles of medieval existence. The rise and fall of the sun, the rotation of the seasons, the steady progress of planting and harvesting, and the slow, measured flow of life that passed almost imperceptibly along the village lanes, across the fields, and through the forested edges beyond. Neighbors often speculated upon these habits, for in a society attentive to deviations from the ordinary, extreme neatness suggested either high personal virtue or hidden unease, and as villagers carried water, chopped wood, or tended animals, they might glance toward the meticulous householder with quiet curiosity, wondering if these repeated motions were intended as a safeguard against unseen chaos, a method of warding off spirits, or an unconscious expression of internal unrest, though such speculation had little effect upon the individual, who continued the gentle, steady practice of arranging, aligning, and tidying, moving through each task as if it were a private meditation, a quiet accompaniment to the soft murmur of activity elsewhere in the village, the distant tolling of bells, the clatter of wooden wheels on uneven streets, and the muted laughter or chatter of children playing among the cottages, all of which blended. By evening, when the sun softened behind distant hills and smoke rose lazily from cottages, the tidy householder might pause to survey the gentle order of hearth, shelf, and floor, taking quiet satisfaction in the neat alignment of objects, the regularity of placement, the subtle symmetry of everyday tools, and the small, repeated gestures that formed a private pattern, almost unnoticed yet deeply comforting, a rhythm that could be followed day after day without thought, effort, or fatigue, and, though neighbors might whisper, speculate, or wonder, the practice persisted, entirely undisturbed by external opinion, reinforcing the soft, meditative cadence that carried through the slow, repetitive cycles of medieval life, from the rising sun to the setting, from the planting of seeds to their harvest, from the daily tending of animals to the occasional journey to the market, each action imbued with subtle reassurance, quiet continuity, and gentle hypnotic repetition that brought calm to the practitioner and underscored the quiet, ordinary beauty of a life shaped by rhythm, routine, and careful attention to the smallest details of the material world. Thus, in the unhurried, measured existence of medieval villages, where time flowed slowly, days repeated in predictable patterns, and life's pressures were experienced with steady endurance rather than urgent anxiety, the practice of excessive tidiness, though perhaps misinterpreted by neighbors, served as a private anchor, a gentle, sleep-inducing rhythm that allowed individuals to feel subtly in control, to observe without disruption, and to harmonize their small corner of the world with the larger, endlessly recurring cycles of nature and human life, providing a quiet, hypnotic stability that was both ordinary and extraordinary in its persistent, meditative simplicity. In the slow, unhurried life of a medieval village, where the rising and setting of the sun marked the gentle passage of time and the tolling of distant church bells blended with the soft murmur of everyday labor, many people followed repetitive rituals with meticulous care, not out of compulsion but out of the quiet comfort that came from repeating familiar motions, and these rituals could take many forms. The washing and folding of linen at precise intervals, the repeated stirring of soups and broths over a low hearth fire, the careful brushing of straw floors, the constant tending of coops and pens, or the methodical checking of grain stacked in storage, each action performed in deliberate, predictable succession, creating a hypnotic rhythm that mirrored the slow patterns of nature and the unchanging flow of village life. And though such repetition was entirely normal for those who practiced it, it was often observed by neighbors as peculiar or noteworthy, for in a society deeply attuned to deviations from the ordinary and quick to interpret unusual behavior as a sign of imbalance, the steady recurrence of small actions could easily be seen as evidence of a mind slightly removed from what was considered conventional. And yet, for the practitioner, these rituals were less about attention to perception than about establishing calm, gentle patterns that allowed the mind to rest, to focus, and to align with the measured cadence of daily existence. Each ritual, no matter how small, was imbued with the soft rhythm of continuity, the precise repetition of steps from hearth to pantry and back, the measured turning of loaves in the oven to ensure even baking, the constant brushing of utensils and tools to remove residual dust or dirt, the careful placement of bowls, ladles, and spoons in the same location each day, and the quiet repetition of prayers at fixed hours, each whisper of words offering a gentle punctuation to the flow of work, a momentary pause to orient the M. The medieval mind, shaped by superstition and religious faith, often viewed these repetitive rituals with cautious curiosity, sometimes interpreting them as outward signs of spiritual devotion, sometimes as markers of anxiety or obsessive tendencies, and the quiet observers might imagine hidden meanings or intentions behind the precise, repeated actions, yet these speculations rarely interrupted the rituals themselves, for the practitioner remained entirely absorbed, moving through each task with deliberate attention and gentle care, finding satisfaction in the repetition itself rather than in the judgment or opinion of others, and the soft continuity of these acts harmonized naturally with the slow, predictable changes of the environment. The tilt of the sun across the sky, the rhythmic flow of the village stream, the measured motion of animals grazing, the gentle swaying of crops in the wind, and the unbroken patterns of daily labor that formed the backbone of survival and communal life. even as children played in the village square, as the blacksmith's hammer rang rhythmically against the anvil, and as neighbors carried water or firewood along the worn paths. Those who followed repetitive rituals continued their slow, deliberate motions, unhurried and untroubled by the external noise or movement, their actions blending seamlessly with the gentle cadence of the world around them. And in this quiet consistency, there was a subtle, sleep-inducing quality, a soft hypnotic rhythm, that could be felt in the mind of the observer if they paused long enough to notice the calm repetition. And yet, for the practitioner, these motions were entirely ordinary, entirely peaceful, a private melody of routine and habit that repeated endlessly without the need for attention or reward, and which provided a gentle anchor amid the otherwise unpredictable elements of village life, including weather, labor demands, social expectations, and the occasional misfortune that touched every age. In the quiet atmosphere of medieval life, where emotions were expected to be contained and expressed only within modest, socially acceptable boundaries, anyone who displayed feelings too openly, whether joy, sorrow, frustration, or laughter, often found themselves delicately observed by neighbors who moved through their own days with measured restraint. And in this world shaped by tradition, religion, and the constant rhythm of labor, the presence of someone whose heart lay more easily on the surface seemed unusual, provoking whispers about sensitivity or imbalance, even though such emotional openness was simply a natural part of human temperament, something woven gently into the mind like threads in a tapestry, yet misunderstood by those who carried with them the deeply embedded belief that strong feelings might invite misfortune, tempt wandering spirits, or disturb the fragile harmony upon which the village relied. The emotionally expressive individuals moved through their days with a kind of softness, their faces revealing what they felt before their words ever could, and in the small cottages with low wooden beams, in the narrow lanes lined with stones shaped by centuries of footsteps, and in the fields where quiet winds passed steadily through tall grains, these people lived as naturally as the changing seasons, letting their hearts shape their gestures, noticing the small details of daily life with an intensity that others interpreted as vulnerability, when in truth it was simply attentiveness, a heightened awareness of the world's gentle textures and shifting moods. When such individuals cried, even softly, it created a ripple among those nearby, for tears were often seen as an inefficiency of spirit, a potential sign of spiritual weakness or melancholy, though the tears themselves often came from simple causes, a memory resurfacing, the stress of long labor, or a moment of beauty observed in the glow of candlelight reflected on wooden surfaces, and because laughter, too, was carefully watched when it came from someone who felt deeply, because an unusually joyful spirit could be interpreted as odd or excessive, raising questions about their grasp on the seriousness of life, for medieval villagers often believed that too much happiness drew the attention of fate, as though the world might correct the imbalance by bringing sadness, and so the overly joyful were sometimes urged to temper themselves, not because their joy was harmful, but because others feared its consequences. And yet in the quiet privacy of their homes, such individuals continued to find delight in small moments, the flicker of firelight, the patter of rain against the shutters, the warmth of freshly baked bread, or the gentle hum of bees beyond the cottage door, and these simple pleasures held their hearts gently, allowing them to experience each day with a level of emotional depth that might have seemed unusual in a community where restraint was often mistaken for strength. Frustration, sadness, or worry, when shown too visibly, also brought attention, for villagers often believed that inner turmoil could attract misfortune or spiritual influence, and so those who sighed often, or paused too long after receiving bad news, or let their shoulders slump in exhaustion became quiet subjects of speculation, though their reactions were, in truth, entirely ordinary responses to difficult days filled with labor, uncertainty, and the constant pressure of survival. Yet the medieval mind associated visible emotion with imbalance, even though the world itself was full of imbalance, harsh winters, unpredictable harvests, sicknesses arriving without warning, and those who felt deeply were simply reflecting the fragility of human life in their expressions, revealing openly what others carefully kept hidden beneath layers of caution, pride, or tradition. As seasons passed, these emotionally expressive individuals became familiar parts of the village landscape. There be, in the soft, unhurried quiet of medieval life, where each day unfolded with the slow rhythm of chores, prayer, and pale sunlight drifting across fields and cottages, those who dreamed too much were often quietly marked as unusual, not because dreaming itself was rare, but because in a world built on survival and practical labor, allowing the mind to wander beyond what was directly in front of one's hands was viewed as strange, even mildly concerning, and villagers noticed when certain individuals drifted into daydreams too often, staring at patterns in wood grain, or watching the dust float lazily through the air, or pausing too long beside the village well as though listening to something only they could hear, and these gentle wanderings of thought, so ordinary to the dreamer, seemed to others like signs of loose discipline or a spirit too easily influenced by imagination. Yet these dreamers, moving slowly through the lanes and fields, often carried within them a deep sensitivity to the quiet beauty of their world. The way mist curled along the edges of early morning roofs, the way the smoke from hearths layered in soft shapes above the cottages, the way the wind brushed the grass in waves, creating gentle patterns that others passed by without noticing, and these small details wove themselves into the dreamer's thoughts, creating stories, questions, and possibilities that drifted gently through their minds as they worked, pulling weeds, grinding grain, or sweeping straw floors with motions so repetitive and calming that their thoughts floated freely, like small boats moving across a slow river with no particular destination. To the villagers, this drifting of attention seemed impractical, even a little troubling, because in a world of constant labor, stillness of thought was valued far less than efficiency of task. And so when the dreamers took an extra moment to watch the way sunlight glowed through a pitcher of water, or paused to listen to the faint song of Bai,